running a series of public lectures to tell you a little bit about the kind of work that we do there. It's a particular delight to have this evening speaking Lisa Manning from our very own department, and I thank her and all of you for coming out tonight. We're competing against both Laverne Cox and the 7th game of the World Series. I'm glad you came here to hear about our soft matter. Lisa got her PhD at University of California, Santa Barbara. Great place to do a PhD.
Learn how to surf, yeah.
Learn how to surf. We like to go there as often as possible. And then she went on to do a postdoc at Princeton Center for Theoretical Sciences before joining us in the fall of 2011. She's been here 3 years now, and it's been wonderful delight to have her here. She's a recipient of an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Award, an UNICEF career grant, along with several other grants. She's also the recipient of 2 departmental teaching awards, so we're really lucky that you're attending this public lecture tonight. She works on a variety of different things. She's interested in non-equilibrium collective behavior. So I think you will learn more about what that is in tonight's lecture. Some of her work is oriented towards biological systems, what the shape of cells are, morphogenesis, collections of cells like tissue, how those behave in mechanical systems, and so on. Tonight, she's going to tell us about these kinds of ideas, but in the context of glassy systems, which is applicable to a wide variety of phenomena in the physical world. So, thanks for coming, and one other thing before I forget, there's a reception afterwards. Okay? Where we have beers, wine, and something to eat. So
only if you're over 21.
Discussion. We got card. Arts and science, Michelle would have to turn off. So I'll pass the microphone to Lisa.
Okay, so usually I don't need a microphone. Can you hear me in the back all right? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me back there? Awesome. Thanks again for coming. I know Mark said it, but I want to say thank you again. This is really great. I can't tell you how excited I am to talk to you today. I want to thank the Syracuse Soft Matter program as well as the Department of Physics for giving me an opportunity to chat with you all tonight. The very first thing I want to say is that if you're a physicist, I hope you're a little bored, because my goal is for this to be a real public lecture. And if you have a question and you're in the audience, probably someone else has a question too, so feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, wave like this if you're in the back, and let me know, because I would love to answer questions. That's what the whole point of this is. All right, so the first thing I want to say is I wanted to introduce you to a lot of my collaborators. I love working with these people. These are some members of my group who are in the audience tonight and will be bored. I also wanted to show you this because some people have an idea of scientists, especially theoretical physicists, as people that like go work in a cave and don't see anyone ever. And that couldn't be further from the truth. We work with a broad array of people, and actually that's one of my favorite parts of my job. And so these are some of the folks I work with. I study soft matter. So this is sponsored by the Syracuse Soft Matter program, and you might ask yourself, well, what's that? So let's start backwards. Let's talk about matter first. And so if I'm thinking about matter or materials, what I'm really asking is, if you give me a black box of stuff, such as the cornstarch that we had as demos out here in the room, you would want me to ask, I would want to answer, what happens when I push or pull on it? How does that material respond to a force? I also might be interested in a related question, which is how does it move or flow? Are there interesting patterns in it? And then we can also ask, well, what does it look like under a microscope? In other words, what is the structure that gives rise to those material properties? So that's what I mean by matter. And then you can say, well, what do you mean by soft? And since I've already told you about forces, you can guess that what I mean is usually the things we study are floppy or easy to bend or squish. That's not always true. Some things become a little stiffer, but they're usually floppy. The reason why they're often floppy is because we study things at what I would call normal temperatures. So there's a lot of really beautiful physics where you have to cool things down to very, very cold, near absolute zero, in order to study them. And you learn a lot of things that way, but you have a lot of equipment that you need in order to make something very, very cold as it can get. And so here we're studying things at normal temperatures and room temperature, because we'd like to know about, the seats you're sitting on, the plastic in your cup, things like that, okay? Often the materials are on larger scales, so while we do consider things like atoms and molecules, we also consider things that are sort of larger, like grains of sand. It's sort of a larger scale. That also helps things be a little bit more floppy sometimes. Often, as Mark mentioned, we think about things as how they relate to biology. Sometimes the soft matter we're interested in is a biological system. Sometimes it just interfaces with it. And sometimes we actually design new things based on things that we learned in biology that are soft, okay? So that's what I mean when I say soft. And then you can ask sort of the important question, which is, why are you studying this, right? Why? There's lots of beautiful physics, actually. You could study astrophysics and learn about black holes. That's really cool. Or quantum computing, which is also super exciting. Think about that. And for me, the reason why I study this, and I hope to convey some of this to you during the talk, is that to me it's a beautiful mixture of physics and mathematics, really the beauty of those things, with stuff that's of immediate practical utility, like importance, things you can actually use right away. And so for me, that's pretty exciting, and I hope to talk to you about that. Okay, so our first example, we're going to start, at the very basics. What's a material you are familiar with? Well, you're familiar with water, right? And if you want to know how water behaves, well, that's pretty easy. You pour it out of a cup, and you see what happens, and of course, it pours. Okay, if it pours out of a cup, that means it doesn't return to where it started. If you try to force it out, it keeps flowing, okay? And then another thing that you can think about, if you want to start thinking about forces, is it easier to run or to walk through a lake? Walk, okay? Why is that? One way of saying that is to say, well, how hard I have to push, what the force is larger in a fluid if you move faster. So in other words, the amount of force you have to apply is sort of proportional to how fast you're going. Okay, so that's why it's harder to run through a lake. Now, we also know that you can do other things to water. One of the things that we all do to water is we put it in a freezer and cool it down into ice so we can have it with our drinks, right? And so you take something which is a fluid and you turn it into a solid, and that's a phase transition. And it's a particularly interesting one. It has a lot of interesting properties. But for the purposes of this talk, I don't want to talk too much about ice, because ice is pretty hard to bend. I don't think any of you have bent an ice cube. And so we want to think about something which is easier to deform. So I was passing around some rubber bands. Are those going around? So maybe some of you have a rubber band to do your own experiment with. So we're going to ask, is there an easier solid to play around with? Okay? So I need for all of you who have a rubber band to do an experiment with me, which is to stretch it. Okay? And then you don't want to let it go too fast, but, let it go. What happens to it? It returns back to where it started, right? So a solid returns back to where it started. If you push it, it wants to go back. Okay? And now I want you to do the same. Okay, bear with me. I know this seems kind of lame, but it's cool. Okay, stretch it again. And now as you're stretching it, pay attention to how much force you have to apply to stretch it, right? Okay? In a solid, how hard it is to push, how much force you have to apply, is proportional to how far you've bent or deformed it. Okay? So this is sort of, in my mind, the easiest way to differentiate differentiate between a liquid and a solid. A liquid, the force is proportional to how fast you go, and in a solid is proportional to how far you go. So this is a macroscopic definition of what the two different phases feel like, okay? Now what we can say is, well, that was a large scale. What about the small scale? What's going on with the structure that makes them behave differently? And so we can look under a very good microscope, and this is an image from a very good microscope. The microscope is so good that this field of view is about 10,000 times smaller than a human hair. Okay, so what you're looking at are actually atoms here. The bright spots are atoms. And you can see that they're all lined up into a nice, neat row here, and that's a crystalline order. And so solids often have this nice crystalline order, and actually that's related to the macroscopic properties, because you can imagine if a particle on that crystalline lattice tries to move out, it gets shoved right back to where it started, and so that's why things want to return to where they started in a crystalline solid. Now, if you have a fluid, and actually it's really hard to get a microscopic picture of a fluid, so this is a simulation. So these are actually a simulation of water molecules. This is just for prettiness. This is the actual simulation. And you can see that the molecules are all jumbled up. They're all disordered. And that's characteristic of a fluid. And that is related to its macroscopic behavior too, because you can see they can sort of move around past each other, right? They're all jumbled up. They can move around pretty easily. Okay? And so now that we have this microscopic understanding of what's going on, now we can think about materials that don't belong to these categories. Okay? And my favorite one is sand. Okay, and so I sort of mentioned this in the abstract. This is a picture of Green Lakes Park. How many of you have been to Green Lakes Park? Okay, how many of you have stood on the sand at Green Lakes Park? Okay, that's amazing. I am amazed when people stand on sand, okay? And why is that? It's because the sand particles are all jumbled up. If you look at the particles that make up the sand, they look just like particles in a fluid, right? So the question is, how does something that looks sort of structurally like a fluid support your weight? So these people are clearly standing. They're not in any danger of falling through, right? That's the question. And in fact, you know that it's a pretty iffy situation because all of you have picked up dry sand through your fingers, right? And it just sifts through. And actually, it looks a lot like a fluid when it does that, right? So you know there's this transition there, okay? So it's sort of amazing you can stand on sand. Okay? The first point I want to make about sand is that the properties of many sand grains are different from the properties of a single sand grain, right? A single sand grain is basically elastic. It's like the elastic rubber bands that you all have, right? But then if I have a collection of grains, we've just decided that they must transition from liquid-like, which is unjammed state. I'll be using that word a lot. Unjammed is liquid-like. And then they transition to a solid-like state, which is jammed. And it's sort of elastic, okay? And the large-scale behavior, we call that an emergent property because you could never figure it out from looking at one sand grain alone. You would never figure out that this could possibly happen, that you could get this transition between liquid and solid. And so, although that's obvious when you think about it, I think I'm going to keep talking about this because I think it's really a cool feature of the types of materials we're talking about. So I'll keep bringing this back. Okay, so now we want to show you a model in a lab for sand. And if I can get this to work, the very first thing I'm going to show you is I have a demo that I'm going to pass around. So this is a demo. I'm going to pass this around. It's a little fragile, so be careful with it. But what it is it's, I don't know if you can see it, there's a lot of little discs in here. Can you see the little discs? And there's some bright lines running through them. And this is a particular type of special material that when a force runs through one of these little grains, and I have it between two cross polarizers, which is just a special film. And so I can shake it up, and so you can see I've shaken it up. And now I'm going to use this plastic window to apply a force to it. And you can see where the forces are going. There's forces between the particles. Does everyone see that? I'm putting more and more force, and there's more and more chains between the particles. Okay, so I'm going to pass this around, and all of you, if you want to do it, you hold it up to the light, and you can look at the force chains that are running through this material. So you just play with this little plastic piece and then pass it on. Okay, and so what's going on? I was holding it up with a lollipop. All right, so let's go back to the laptop, and let's take a picture, take a look at an experiment. Okay, and so this is a big chunk of this same material. And you can see that when a person applies a rod, this is a picture of a rod being applied to those particles, you can see that the forces don't go out in some uniform way. These forces moving through the particles go out in these chain-like structures. Can everybody sort of see the chain-like structures? And this tells you that there's forces that are being transmitted from this object to the boundary. And so these sort of force chains help carry loads like you stand in on sand. So this sort of gives you an idea of why this material might be sort of acting like a solid. It's one way in which it's acting like a solid. Another thing that you can see from this picture is that this material is also pretty jumbled up and disordered, right? It's what I would call a disordered solid because it's supporting stresses, but it's also jumbled up, okay? And now we can look at an experiment. So this is when you apply even more force to this material. So if you apply even more, let's see if I can find my pointer. If you apply even more force to this material, so this material is now being compressed in this way and expanded in that way, then you can see that there's force chains that are sort of running through. The other thing that you can see in this movie, and hopefully it continues to play, is that there's rearrangements of particles. In other words, you're applying enough force to this material that these particles are changing their neighbors. And that means that over long time scales, this material is behaving like a fluid. Let's see if we can get it to play. All right. So you can see the network is reorganizing and particles are changing neighbors. And so this is more of fluid-like behavior. Okay? And so then we can ask ourselves, well, what's going on? We talked about water transitioning from a fluid, water, to a solid, which is ice, and we said that that was a phase transition, right? Well, here we have a material that's transitioning from a solid-like phase to a liquid-like phase. And it turns out that there's two control parameters for this. It's not the temperature, which is what it is for a fluid, but it's the density on this axis. So this is like you take your favorite pile of sand and you smush it together and make it more dense. And as you make it more and more dense, it goes from being liquid-like, so it sifts through your fingers, to more and more solid-like so that you can stand on it and it supports stresses. Okay? And the other axis over here is the applied shear force. So that was like the experiment I just showed you. If you sort of shear a chunk of the material and you really force it to start moving, you can make it rearrange again and behave like a solid. So along this axis, going up and down, you can start with a material that's jammed, and if you apply enough force, it can become unjammed. I think that's pretty cool. This is a weird type of phase transition, right? It's not the normal one you're used to. And I have a demo here to sort of help illustrate that picture. So this is a 2-liter bottle cut in half, and here's a drink bottle in the middle of it. And the first experiment that I'm going to do is I'm going to just put some, this happens to be kitty litter, okay, but a granular material in around it. So I'm just, putting some granular material around it, all around the Gatorade bottle. Okay, here we go. All right, so can you verify that I have some amount of granular material here, okay? Everyone believes me? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I just made like a little sand cast on the beach, and I'm going to pull the bottle out, okay? Ready, everyone? Okay, that was a pretty boring demo, okay? So I can just pull the bottle out, didn't take me much effort. I'm kind of a weakling, and I didn't have to strain it all to do that, okay? But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the experiment. Just put a little sand in the bottom to get us started, same as before. I'm going to put the bottle in, same as before. I'm going to put some amount of granular material. I'm going to try to get exactly the same amount so you can't accuse me of doing anything different there. Okay, some amount of granular material in there. All right. And now the only difference is that I am going to slowly and gently tap this bottle. Just a little bit. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to increase the density of this sand in here, right? I'm trying to make it just a little more dense. And even those of you sitting in the front can see you can't see the level going down, right? I'm not changing the density very much. I'm changing it a little bit though, okay? And so now the hope is that we'll see something different because I just changed the density. I just went from over there to over there maybe on the density, right? How cool is that, right? So this thing is behaving like a solid. It's holding up the weight of the bottle. It's holding up all of this stuff, right? It's pretty cool. And all I did was change the density. All right, so how do I get this bottle back out? Any ideas? Shake it up. Or to be a little bit more dramatic about it, if I wanted to be a little dramatic because I'm standing in front of a room of people, right? Is that I could give it one really good whack, right? Instead of a small tap, I could give it a big whack, right? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay? And if the theory is true, I should be able to pull this out really easily again. Hopefully I can. Pretty cool, huh? All right. You can all do this at home. Kitty litter, sand, whatever. It's pretty easy. Okay. So what did we learn? We learned that we could easily go across this jamming transition, and we didn't have to change the density hardly at all, right? Just a teeny tiny bit, and we went from a liquid to a solid. So now I want to talk for a minute about phase transitions, because actually there's a beautiful set of theories in mathematics behind phase transitions, and I want to talk a little bit about them. Okay, so to orient you on this plot, this is pressure on this axis, and this is temperature in this axis. And we in this room are happily here at about 1 atmosphere. So we're sitting on this line here at 1 atmosphere of pressure. And we are not boiling, and we're not freezing, so we're somewhere in here in the temperature. So we're somewhere in here on this line. And that tells us that water in this room should be water, right? It should be a fluid, okay? Now what we can do is we can do an experiment in our homes, right? And we can put the water in our freezer and take it at 1 atmosphere across this line from water into ice. And that's going to be a phase transition. We already talked about that a little bit, right? The interesting thing is that this is what's called a discontinuous phase transition. So let me talk for a minute about what that is. This is a model of a system that has a crystal and a fluid phase. The blue is ordered. You can even see by your eye that it's ordered, but it's colored blue to show us more ordered. And the red is much less ordered, so that sort of looks like a liquid. And what you may see in this picture is that things are basically either blue or red, and there's not much in between. In other words, there's sort of these droplets of liquid inside the solid, the crystalline solid phase. And in fact, if I wanted to describe what was happening, I could make up an order parameter, and all that is to say, how ordered is the system? And so over here, the system would be very ordered, and so that would be an order parameter of some large number. And so on this plot of an order parameter versus temperature, if I'm cold, which means I'm ice, which means I'm ordered, then I have a high order parameter up here. And then as I basically melt my system, which this is a picture of, I go across this 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and as soon as I get a material that's above that, I have something which is a fluid, which is a liquid, and that has an order parameter of 0 because it's not ordered at all. Okay? And I spend some time here at the transition point because I start nucleating these droplets of fluid inside the solid. But the important thing is that I just transition here at this temperature, and below that temperature I'm one thing, and then I discontinuously jump to the other thing. That's why we use the word discontinuous, okay? So this is a discontinuous phase transition, and there's a lot of beautiful math that I won't have time to talk about associated with that, okay? The other type of transition we could do with our water, if we had something we didn't want to do at home, because it would have to happen at 374 degrees Celsius and also 218 atmospheres of pressure. But if we were here at this critical point, so let me show you what this plot looks like. This is a special type of phase transition that we can think about too. And there's a lot of beautiful mathematics associated with this critical point. So let me tell you a tiny bit about that because I think it's beautiful. So the idea is we have an order parameter here again. In this case, it's the difference in density between the gas phase and the fluid phase. Okay? And as I change the temperature, so I basically change the temperature across that critical temperature, so we're at 218 atmospheres and 705 degrees Fahrenheit, then I go from having something which has both a fluid and gas to something which is sort of a mixture of the two. You can't tell the difference between the fluid and the gas beyond this point. And the interesting thing is that there's a a beautiful set of theories that help describe this, what's called a continuous transition. And it's called continuous because I go continuously to 0. I don't have a jump. Okay, that's why it's that. And I also have it generically what I see is that there's a growing length scale in the problem. And so let me just show you a movie of a growing length scale. So this is a liquid and a gas mixture really close to the critical point. And the black tells you the density. So the thing I'd like for you to see in this movie, if I can get it to play, is that this is right at the critical point, and so you can see these swirly clouds of darkness, and that's a very large length scale. So this is a length scale much larger than the length scale of a typical molecule. And so what you see is this sort of system-spanning fluctuations, large length scale fluctuations in the behavior, and that generally happens near one of these critical transitions. Okay. And the thing I wanted to emphasize to you today is that because of that beautiful mathematics, you can actually see that near the critical point, all fluids have the same behavior. So this is actually 8 different fluids. It looks like a bunch of data points that are exactly the same, but they actually correspond to totally different fluids near the critical point, and they all collapse onto the same line. So this is temperature and this is pressure. And this is an idea of universality which helps us to understand things about phase transitions in materials. Okay, so why did I go through all of that? Well, because it turns out that jamming, this transition that we've been talking about, is actually cool because it's a little bit of both. It's got something for everyone. So the first thing that we can look at is an order parameter. And in this system, the order parameter is how many contacts does each sand grain make with its neighbors. If it's below the jamming transition, so the jamming transition is right here, so this is what a picture looks like below, all of the particles are really, really close, but they're not touching, okay? So that means that the number of contacts here is identically 0, okay? And then I can increase the density, and right exactly when I hit this critical density, I don't know if you can see it, but there's force lines running through all of these particles. All of these particles have, in this system, 4 nearest neighbors, exactly 4. Okay, and so this is, and so the order parameter, because you jump to having 4 contacts, is discontinuous. On the other hand, if we look at the behavior of the system, and so I know this looks like a bunch of gobbledygook, let me translate. So on this axis is how hard must I push on my system, and then this axis is how slowly does it move. Okay, and this is a scaling collapse. Again, you know how I just showed you that picture of a critical scaling collapse of fluids? This is the same type of critical scaling function, except now I have 2 branches. I have a liquid branch, that basically where the thing looks like a liquid, and a solid branch where it looks like it behaves like a solid. And so the only thing I want you to take away from this plot is that this jamming transition, by using the mathematics of this beautiful scaling theory, we can show that this jamming transition has character of both. Are there any questions about that so far? Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is why might you care about this stuff? So I told you about sand, and sand is kind of cool. Okay, but what other types of materials exhibit a jamming transition? Now, I'm going to be looping in some other things because there's a class of materials that have the exact same or a very similar transition, but instead of changing as a function of density, they change as a function of temperature. And if something goes from being a disordered fluid to a disordered solid as a function of temperature, we call that a glass transition. But it's the same physics. Okay, and so this is one of my favorite materials. It's called a bulk metallic glass. And the first thing I'm going to do is show you a movie, again, if I can find my pointer. Okay, so this is materials which have bottoms which are stainless steel. This liquid metal stuff happens to be a bulk metallic glass at the bottom. And this one has a bottom plate that's made of titanium. For some reason, none of my movies are playing all the way through tonight. I don't know why. What? Oh. Okay. So if we drop a ball, we're going to drop 3 identical steel balls from the top. And we're going to let them bounce on each of these 3 materials. Again, the one in the middle is a bulk metallic glass. And so when they bounce, you can see that the steel ball bounces up and down and slowly gets lower and lower on both the steel and on the titanium, but the one that's on this bulk metallic glass just keeps bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. It has a lot of other cool properties. This property means that it's very springy, very elastic. So you can imagine that would be useful for something like a golf club. And people use it for watches and also for medical devices. And if you look inside the material, it actually has the same type sort of disordered structure. And it's that disordered structure which gives it a lot of these nice properties. So these are really good candidates for lots of materials, these bulk metallic glasses. All right. Another thing, which some of you may have played with out in the lobby, is cornstarch and water. I don't know how many of you have seen this video before. Unfortunately, it's way better with the sound. Okay? But these guys are going to run through a giant tub of cornstarch and water. He's running, 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 and sinking. Okay? Oh, he's sinking. Okay? But this other guy, if he moves fast enough, he can still run right on top of it, right? No problem. What's the difference? The difference is how fast they're moving across the material. So you can ask yourself, well, why is that? Why is that behavior different, right? And so actually there's a lot of, I think, very exciting work going on in our field right now to try to understand this. So this is courtesy of Eric Brown, a colleague and friend of mine. It's a picture of, in slow motion, of a high-speed camera of somebody running across this. Oh, every time I point my pointer, I can't point my pointer at the same time. Okay. Running across a mixture of cornstarch and water. And so you can see that the waves propagating out when his foot hits, right? And you can see that it's supporting his weight. And the idea is the reason why this cornstarch can go from being liquid-like to being solid-like has two reasons for it. One reason is that when you step on the cornstarch, you actually dilate the particles that are sitting, the cornstarch particles that are in the water, just like we changed the density in our sand experiment, right? So you can change the density and therefore you become more solid-like. But another thing that's going on, and this is sort of a brand new discovery, is that it also turns out that force chains are probably propagating through the material all the way to the bottom of this tank. And those force chains, just like this microscopic experiment, also help to support the person. So there's sort of two effects that go to you being able to walk on a mixture of water and cornstarch. Okay, and this is something we can understand. I don't know if you can also see, but you can drop a bowling ball on this stuff. You can drop an egg on this stuff. There's a lot of fun things to be done with cornstarch and water. So it's part of the same story. All right, so why is this important? I mean, it's interesting, but why should we really care deeply about it? And I think there are a lot of reasons. The first reason is that there's a lot of industrial processes that process granular materials. This is a grain silo that is broken apart. And it's broken apart because there were force chains, of course, in this granular material, and they were very strong in certain places, and it was an unexpected sort of strong force acting on the metal container for this granular material. So we need to be able to understand those forces in order to understand how to design containers and processing units for these granular materials. Another thing you might not have thought about is earthquake faults. This is a picture of an earthquake fault, and I don't know if you can see, but this brown area right here is actually all fault gouge, which is a granular material. It turns out that between earthquake plates are granular materials. And so when an earthquake happens, actually the largest uncertainty that scientists have about how it will propagate, like how dangerous is it to be living in San Francisco right now, is what is the friction law on this fault. And that's determined by the way that the granular material moves here at this interface. So if we can understand this better, we can make better predictions for magnitudes of earthquakes on earthquake faults. Another thing is, as I showed you this bulk metallic glasses, and I told you they could be used for all this cool stuff, but I didn't show you any pictures of very large structures. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But one of them is the fact that if you take a chunk of this material in a pillar like this and you compress it, it will shear band. It will basically fail along this plane here catastrophically. So it's very hard to use this as a structural material because of this failure mechanism. And this is special to disordered solids. It turns out that most disordered solids fail like this. And so we'd like to be able to understand this so we can design better materials for structures. Finally, there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with granular materials that granular materials are particularly good at. So for example, this is a movie of a shooting robot. And you'll see what I mean. It's a basketball shooting robot. And so this basically robot has an arm, and at the edge of this arm is essentially a balloon filled with coffee grinds, okay, dry coffee grinds. And the idea is that as you change the density of those coffee grinds by either adding more air to the balloon or taking more air out of the balloon, you can change that hand-like object, from being very fluid-like to very solid-like. And what that means is it can do all sorts of extremely delicate tasks. For example, it can pick up and pour a glass of water, or it can, shoot bolts into boxes. And this is because it can change its material properties very rapidly. And it's actually one of the first robotic hands to be able to pass these tests, the ones that's showing you right now. So this is useful. Another use for this is for impact protection. Because, for example, you can see that if you have a body impacting a bunch of granular material, again, you can see the force change through this material, you can see that the granular material dissipates a lot of energy as the granular particles move away. And it also spreads out the forces over a very wide area. And so these sort of uses for granular materials are just being investigated, I think, and are an exciting sort of reason to care about these materials. So I just wanted to take a second to tell you that you may not have thought, right, that a person playing with cornstarch and water would be a good thing to fund from the federal government, right? But it turns out that funding something like cornstarch and water can lead to things like this, very, very quickly lead to things like this, which are really useful. So it's just something, think about funding for federal funding for science, and that it might be good. All right. Okay, so now from a theoretical perspective, we'd like to understand how materials flow and fail, right? That's sort of what all of those applications were about. Okay, and so if we'd like to understand how they flow and fail, let's talk about materials that we understand better first. So a material we understand well is a standard liquid. So this is a very simple picture of a liquid. So these are sort of pictures of little molecules in a fluid, and they're all jumbled up and they're making connections with their neighbors, which is what those red lines represent. And if this material, I either sort of shear it a little bit or let it fluctuate, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a rearrangement somewhere in the material. So this is just a little rearrangement. I change the bonds. And the thing is, because it's disordered, those fluctuations sort of happen everywhere sort of randomly. In contrast, if I have a crystalline solid, so this is where the atoms line up in nice neat rows, if I shear this material, it breaks at what's called a dislocation. So let me tell you about a dislocation. Does everybody see that there's 3 rows up here, and then down here there's 4 rows? So there's an extra row right here. This little piece here is a dislocation, and if I shear the material like this, where do you think it's going to break? It's probably going to break right there, right? Because I only have to break 1 bond, and if it broke anywhere else, it would have to break a lot more bonds. Okay, so that's where it breaks. And the point is that although in a fluid we have no idea where it's going to break, in a crystalline solid we sort of know exactly where it's going to break, and so we can come up with a theory for these things. Actually, that's still tricky, but you can do it. There's a fundamental question for disordered solids, though, which is, are disordered solids more likely, do they just rearrange anywhere? If I shear it, where is it going to break? Will it just break randomly anywhere, like a fluid, because it sort of looks like a fluid? But it behaves like a solid, so maybe there are specialized little areas, which I'm going to call flow defects, or localized excitations, where it prefers to break. Right? And if that happened, that would be cool, because then I could make a theory about those things, right? That would make things a lot easier. Okay, so in order to answer that question, my group thinks about sound modes. Okay, sound modes and sounds. Okay, and so this is sort of a cool thought experiment. So imagine that you have like a granular system, like the kind that we've been passing around. Okay, and imagine you can reach in there and push on each particle in that disordered solid, right? You're pushing on each particle. Okay, and apparently this solid contains capital N particles in it. Okay, so if we're in a solid, then if I push on a particle, well, it's a solid, so it's going to want to go back to where it started, right? We talked about that already. And it turns out that if there's no damping in the system, if I push it, actually all of the particles particles will slosh around, right? They'll oscillate back and forth. That's what's going to happen in my solid. So you can imagine all of the particles sort of sloshing around and oscillating back and forth. For those of you who have taken a bit of physics, this is like a harmonic oscillator. And in fact, we can use the equation F equals ma in order to write down an equation for a harmonic oscillator, which looks like this. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this talk that's going on. But we have basically the idea that this vector u is an n-dimensional vector, and it basically tells me the displacement of each particle in this packing of particles. And what this equation says is that if I displace it, all the particles by u, then there's some big matrix M that'll tell me how the system vibrates. And that's what this piece is. It's just telling me that this is vibrations of the solid. Okay? And so what happens is that sound modes, that's actually what sound modes are. They are the low frequency sloshing about of a solid, its response to perturbations. And in an experiment or in a simulation, I can actually calculate this big matrix M and extract all of the sound modes, all of the vibrational modes in the system. Turns out there's a lot of them. There's the number of particles times the number of dimensions of them. And for those who have a little bit of mathematics, the sound modes are the eigenvectors of this matrix M, and the eigenvalues of that matrix are the frequencies with which they oscillate. So that's what this picture is trying to help you think about. It's basically sort of, imagine a particle in an egg carton, and this is the position of all of the particles in the solid, and then they slosh around like this, and those are the sound modes of the system. Okay? So why do we look at sound modes if we're trying to find these sort of answer the question of whether there are defects? And the answer is because once you look at the sound modes, I told you how we could calculate them. They tend to look like these red pictures. So these little arrows are the displacements of all of the particles in a packing, and each one corresponds to a different sound mode, a different sloshing about in the solid. Okay, and this one actually, if you could listen to it, it would actually sound like a tone. You could hear it. But you can see in a disordered solid, there are things that look like this which are very, very localized. And those are different. Those are special to disordered solids. And then we guess, well, maybe those special places are the defects. Maybe that's where the system breaks. Okay? So then what we do is my group and collaborators have come up with a method of identifying these localized excitations. So those are the colored things here, or the yellow things here. So these are these localized bits. And then we shear the material until it breaks, or we let it fluctuate until it breaks. And those are the little red arrows. So these are the red arrows sitting on top of it. And very generically, we find that the system breaks at one of these defects we've identified. Okay? We can also do a better job. So this is some work with a graduate student here at Syracuse named Ted Waitman. And I'm not going to go through all the details. This is sort of I'm going to show you some mathematical equations and promise you it's there. But we put something that looks like springs on top of the system. And that perturbs the system, and then we get even better localized modes. So we can really figure out where these defects are. And then that answers the question. So imagine this was a multiple choice question on a test, and you wanted to know whether these things were more like fluids or more like solids. The right answer is they're more like solids. They have these localized defects inside of them. And then these localized defects actually self-organize. We think this is what we're working on next. Self-organize to generate those failure planes that you saw. Okay, and so the idea is this, for the first time ever, we can see the defects. So now we can ask, well, what do they do when we share a system? And that's what we're doing right now. Okay, so this is very exciting to me. And I know that Mark said I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about it for just like 5 minutes because I think it's super fun. What time is it, Mark? Perfect. So I'm just going to talk about this for 5 minutes because I think it's so cool I can't help but tell you. Okay. So the idea the question is, can we think of biological tissues as materials? You say, well, clearly cells and biological tissues are totally different from any of the other things you've been talking about. But I want to point out that if I think about what's going on in a movie like this, let me sort of loop it. Let me show it to you again. Let me start it from the beginning. So this is a wound healing experiment. Those are cells, and they're crawling inward to fill a wound. Okay? And you can see that on the edges, they're not moving very much at all. In fact, they look pretty jammed. And as they get to the center, they move around a lot more. They're moving around and interacting with one another, and they have a lot more freedom. And so you might ask yourself, well, maybe if I thought about this as a material, maybe I could understand something about this process, okay? This is a very cool image taken by a good friend of mine, Eva Maria Schatz-Collins, and this is some cells that are moving around during development. So this is a developing zebrafish embryo. And if you label the cells specially and take a movie of the nuclei in the cells, they sort of have these beautiful flow patterns. So hopefully you can see here that there's some possibility of a transition between liquid-like behavior and maybe solid-like behavior. So we'd like to understand that. And the way that we're sort of going about modeling that is we're sort of thinking about modeling this picture, this wound healing experiment, these two-dimensional layers first. And then this little red cell is just a little simulation of a red cell that's crawling around in a monolayer of other cells. And the way that we actually do this is by shortening one edge until it gets to a point and growing it in the other direction. So this is what's called a T1 transition. Doesn't matter, it just means that if I do enough of these switches, I can actually get a cell to move around in a monolayer. And in fact, that's basically the only thing that can happen. The fact that these cells are all compressed tightly together means that it has to happen. And this is just a picture from an experiment to show you that this is very much what an actual experiment looks like, too. All right. And so, reminder, I showed you that there is this beautiful phase transition that has this sort of scaling behavior. And the fact that I had this scaling behavior told me it was a continuous phase transition instead of a discontinuous phase transition. So what I can do is I can take this model and I can do a bunch of stuff and calculate how hard it is for that cell to move around in there. And I'm doing this on a computer so I can calculate everything. And it turns out that that model I just showed you has a continuous phase transition. I was really surprised. This is, Max is in the audience, this is my postdoctoral researcher who did this work. And basically what it tells you is that this continuous phase transition with all of this beautiful math and beautiful scaling laws, we expect it should happen in biological tissues, and we actually have preliminary data showing it does. How cool is that? Okay. And it's not controlled by temperature or density because cells can't really control that. It's controlled by P0, which is the ratio between a cell's perimeter and its area in these 2D slices. And it can be measured in an experiment. And it increases, this parameter increases as cells do things like express more adhesion molecules. Cells express these molecules that make them stick to other cells. They're called cadherins. And this will increase that parameter, and for example. And the major takeaway point from this, besides the fact that this is pretty crazy that it happens in a biology system, is that you would never guess this from studying single cells, ever, because it's a property of the group of cells. And so you don't have to be a physicist to study it, but you need to think about what happens when I have large numbers of interacting objects to get to that point. And I think that's the real beauty of techniques like this, is that it gives you the tools for asking precisely these types of questions that you could never guess by looking at a single cell alone. Okay, so disordered materials can transition from a liquid to a solid with very little change in their microscopic structure. They sort of look the same on both sides of the transition. They have tunable material properties, right? I could just tune the properties of this container by tapping it just a little bit, right? That's pretty neat. They have this special type of phase transition, and they have some things which make it difficult to model flow and failure, but that's what we're working on here and we're really excited about. We can use sound modes to find defects that lead to flow and failure in these materials. And biological tissues can be thought of as disordered materials, and you can figure out a lot of stuff about them from thinking about them like that. So I wanted to thank all of you so much for coming and listening, and I'd be really excited to answer questions. Before that, I want to say I never get to show my daughter. I talk, so I'm going to show her. That's my daughter, who is awesome, and my husband who let me be here. Thanks to a bunch of folks, this whole big group of folks who helped me out. Especially, can I get a round of applause for the Society of Physics students who are doing the cornstarch demo out there? Can I get a round of applause? Thank you.
Questions?
Please ask anything. Yeah.
Describe in a little more detail your force chains.
Ah, good question. So the force chains, which are this picture right here. Let me go back to the picture that has them so I can talk about them a little bit. Okay. So in a system which is ordered, if I took all of these particles, and it's actually possible to put them all in a nice crystalline array, if I press down on them with a rod like this, there will be some, what I would call an isotropic behavior, which means there will be certain directions that have more force and some that have less. But it won't have this sort of strange spiky behavior. The forces will sort of diffuse out away in a way that you can actually describe. For those of you who know about it in terms of sort of Green's functions and propagators, it's a very nice, well-behaved behavior for an elastic system. And that's because of the order you can sort of coarse grain away the details. In contrast, here you cannot coarse grain away the details. The details matter. So this is a picture of these little particles, and they're specially made so that when they experience a force, they light up. And actually, you may have been able to see it in the thing I was passing around, that the more you squish them, the more they light up, and you can actually count the number of fringes and actually measure a force using this apparatus. It's actually used beautifully by Bob Behringer's group to measure forces. And people try to characterize the statistics of these objects. They have really interesting statistical properties. They are what's called scale-free, which means they fall off like a power law. They also sort of allow the force to be transmitted from one space to the other without touching some parts of the material, right? There's some parts of the material that almost can be liquid-like. They could rearrange, and there's other parts that are transmitting the forces. So this very heterogeneous behavior gives rise to some of the properties that we've discussed later on in the talk. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yes?
So is there some sort of relation between this and calculation of the source chains? Is it?
So you're clearly a physicist, but the answer is yes, almost certainly. There's a really nice couple of papers on the archive, which is this place where all physicists post their research so everyone can read it. And there's a couple of nice papers that explain how actually the behavior of these force chains at very small forces actually can be used to estimate both the density of defects in the system and rigidity percolation in the system. So yes, these can be used to think about that.
Questions? Yeah.
How does the force change relate to the effects that you found?
Ah, that is a great question. I have a set of collaborators that are working with me to basically look and see. So what we've done is try to group these force chains together into regions that sort of move together like a solid. So you can use these force chains as a way to group things that move together like a solid. And then our conjecture is that soft spots are intersections between regions that move like solids. And so we're in the process of testing that conjecture now in simulations and actually in an experiment. It's a great question.
You showed that you can find with this sound analysis modes of vibrations where the weak spots are, I think.
Yeah.
Could you work that in reverse and fail materials with certain acoustic waves?
Yeah, so Paul Johnson at Los Alamos is thinking about doing exactly that. Because there's a way, well actually what he's thinking about doing is a little bit more clever, is that he actually sort of vibrates the system in a spot and then looks at the waves that come out all around, and then he can refocus that scattering back to that point. And we're talking about doing a similar thing to basically see if we can sort of read out what forces you would have to put back into code. Yeah, it's good, yeah.
Okay, well, let's thank you
thanks again and continue the discussion at the reception. Thanks.